All right, let's get started. So this is Joe Envik here, and I am particularly excited for this session about designing impactful carbon reduction targets. So if you go to the next slide, as we heard in the opening plenary and throughout the summit, frankly, climate leadership is top of mind for many of our partners. That is evidenced by the over 2,700 of you that have registered for this session. So thank so many of you for being with us today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I should also note that more than 55 Better Buildings partners, including some of our speakers today, have joined the Better Buildings low carbon pilot to demonstrate real world pathways to low and no carbon buildings. And I highly suggest that you reach out to me or to your account manager if you're currently a partner, if you'd like to consider participating in that pilot. But more broadly, if you were watching LinkedIn or reading press releases on Earth Day a few weeks ago, you will have seen a massive wave of new carbon targets being announced across pretty much all sectors. But of course, as with many things in our industry, the devil really is in the details. And so the details are exactly what we're going to get into today. So over the next hour, we're going to wrangle with some questions like, how can organizations set carbon reduction targets that are both ambitious and achievable? How can we put plans in place to actually meet those targets while reinforcing rather than detracting from our organization's core mission? And why is it so gosh darn hard to define what carbon neutrality actually means? Why are there so many different definitions for that floating around? These are all topics we're going to be wrangling with over the next hour. So this session is intended to complement the Teamwork Makes the Dream Work session, which was on Tuesday. And that was all about assembling the right team and the right partnerships to achieve carbon reduction targets. So if you missed that one, totally fine. This is more of a sister session as opposed to a sequel, but I do encourage you to go back and watch that session when the recording becomes available. So before we dive in, a couple of logistical notes. The session is going to be recorded and posted to the Better Buildings Solutions Center for your reference. So we'll follow up via email when the slides become available. And you're going to be in listen-only mode as an attendee. So if you experience any audio or visual issues at any point, just use the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and our technical support people will get you taken care of. If we go to the next slide, again, I'm Joe Envik. I'm going to be moderating today. I lead the clean energy finance and carbon solutions practice at Retech Advisors, which is a consulting firm here in the DC area. I also co-lead the Better Buildings financing sector on behalf of DOE in collaboration with Kyle Saltzman, who's running the slides today. And I've also been closely involved in the DOE low carbon pilot as well. So it's great to be with you all. If you go to the next slide, our agenda is pretty simple. I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the recent trends in carbon targets. We'll spend most of our time on speaker presentations from our three great speakers today, and then we'll have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A at the end. You should be a veteran of Slido by now, but if you go to the next slide, we're going to be using Slido again for Q&A, polling, and session feedback. So please go ahead and go to slido.com now, because we are going to do a poll. You can do that on a mobile device or by opening a new window in your internet browser, and go to enter today's event code, which is DOE. And then once you enter that code, select the session title, which is Pathways to Zero. And so if you'd like to, once you get that set up, if you'd like to ask our panelists any questions now or during their presentations, feel free to enter those. You can also upvote questions that you would like, other people have asked that you would like to make sure get answered. So if you please go ahead and open up Slido now, we're going to do a poll asking which sectors you come from. So if you go ahead and fill out the poll now, that would be great. Higher education off to an early lead. Industrial manufacturing, contractors and service providers. Yeah, I've ventured to say this is one of the most diverse groups of folks from different sectors that we've had yet. It's like a bunch of contractors and service providers, multifamily represented, state and local governments, commercial real estate, a big other category. So, okay, great. Well, we're going to be tackling this topic from several different angles here. So excited to have such a diverse group of folks with us. If you go ahead and go back to the slides, I want to briefly introduce our panelists today. So I'm going to introduce them more fully when they get to their sections of the presentation. But we've got Matt from the city of Milwaukee, Jim from MetLife Investment Management, and Mark from the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation. So welcome to you all. These folks are all, frankly, trendsetters in the world of sort of setting and achieving ambitious carbon reduction targets. So please feel free to reach out to them, and we'll have their contact information at the end as well. So thank you guys for being with us today. If you go to the next slide, I'm just going to do a couple of minutes on background here to kind of set the stage for what's going on in the market when it comes to carbon target setting. I mentioned the big wave of carbon targets that happened around the time of Earth Day a few weeks ago, but that wave, that was really just the cresting of a wave that's been building for a long time. So if you look, this is a great data set that's gathered by Natural Capital Partners that shows the Fortune 500 companies specifically, which of them or what percentage of them have set carbon targets. And you can see that back in 2015, it was like 3% of the Fortune 500. And now in 2020, it's 30% of the Fortune 500. So it's a 5x increase over just a 4-year period. And that includes things like science-based targets, which is labeled as SBT here, RE100, which is a renewable energy target, as well as carbon neutral and net zero targets. So these are sort of the more ambitious of carbon targets, even within that sort of universe. And frankly, can you think of the last time that you saw such a diverse group of companies as the Fortune 500 so rapidly adopt the same business practice? I think maybe internet or computers was probably like the last time that happened, right? So there's clearly a sea change underway in the way that many different organizations are thinking about carbon targets and how critical they are to their strategic planning. If we go to the next slide, there's also another trend that's happening right now is an increasingly diverse set of frameworks that are available to help with reporting, scoring, and also providing guidance on setting carbon reduction targets. This is kind of a smattering of some of the most common frameworks, many of which you'll probably be familiar with. But you have science-based targets, which enables organizations to set targets that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. You have the old tried and true CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, which allows organizations to report on their carbon footprint and then receive a score for how they're doing, both in terms of their emissions and their policies. You got the RE100 initiative, which targets 100% renewable energy by a certain target date. You got TCFD, which is Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that's more focused on kind of climate risk, disclosing those risks. You have a variety of different carbon neutral certifications, right? So all of these have a sort of slightly different approach or lens on the market. And then the three on the right-hand side are three relatively recent developments, which are sort of sector-specific carbon reduction or carbon neutrality targets. So you have the UN Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, not to be confused with the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which are separate things. And you also have the ULI Net Zero 2050 commitment for commercial real estate. So lots of frameworks out there. There's a lot more than this that are kind of growing, and they all fit together and interact in different ways. I won't go into much more detail on these now, but happy to get into these during Q&A. And if we go to the next slide, there's also some great guidance out there about how to set a carbon target. So if you're starting from square one and kind of want to know what the best practices are on setting a carbon target, I would highly suggest you check out the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Mitigation Goal Standard. So if you've ever done a greenhouse gas inventory, chances are you've used the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Standard as to sort of guide your methodology for doing the inventory. This is sort of the gold standard for inventories. But they also have a goal standard, which can be a helpful way to think about the different ways that you set carbon targets. So just to give you a sense, there's no one right way to do this. There's lots of different methods being used. Excuse me. Some folks are using a base year method where you select a base year like 2010 and you measure all of your reductions in an absolute sense against that base year. Some folks just have a fixed level goal. This is a little bit less common, but it is used in some cases where you just pick a certain emissions target per year and try to stay under that target. Some folks use a base year intensity goal. So rather than an absolute goal, you set it based on emissions per square foot or emissions per unit of GDP or unit of revenue. This tends to be a good approach for organizations that have rapidly changing asset portfolios. So like in commercial real estate, for example, if you're buying and selling buildings frequently, setting an absolute emissions reduction target can be detrimental because if your portfolio grows by 30%, chances are your emissions are going to grow by 30% too, even if you're improving your energy efficiency and emissions intensity. And then some folks, and this is more common, I'd say, in kind of state and local and federal governments, some folks use a baseline scenario goal where they project out what their anticipated emissions are going to be over a 20, 30, 50-year period. And then they set a target for reducing emissions below that sort of business as usual baseline. So again, no right way to do this, although some of the frameworks that I discussed on the prior slide do have opinions about which of these you should or should not use. So there is some guidance out there, but this is a good place to start. If you go to the next slide, my final slide before I hand it over to Matt here, I want to highlight a great tool for carbon target planning, which is called the State and Local Planning for Energy Platform, or SLOPE. And what SLOPE does is integrates and delivers data on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and sustainable transportation in an easy to access online platform that enables sort of data-driven state and local energy planning. So this is particularly useful if you're a state and local government looking to understand the local grid mix and what your opportunities are. But I will say, even if you're not, this is like one of the coolest things I've checked out in the last few weeks. So I highly suggest you go poke around. and check out the data, because it gives you a lot of great insight into what's going on in the energy markets in these localities. So I won't go into more detail now because the city of Milwaukee actually made use of this, and so Matt's gonna talk about it more in his presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matt. Each of our three folks are going to present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A. But just to quickly introduce Matt, he's the city of Milwaukee's he runs the city of Milwaukee's energy reduction team, which is tasked with reducing energy use and emissions from city buildings, fleet, and operations. He also manages the city's other energy efficiency programs and initiatives, which includes Better Buildings Challenge for commercial buildings, ME2 residential energy efficiency financing program, the City of Milwaukee PACE financing program, and the city's interdepartmental electric vehicle readiness team. So I don't know how he found time to be with us today, given all the things on his plate, but I'm sure glad he did. And I'm going to hand it over to Matt.
Thanks, Joe, for the introduction. Just want to do a quick intro to Milwaukee, because I know not everybody is super familiar with our city. So we're actually Wisconsin's largest city and the fourth largest in the Great Lakes region, right on the coast of Lake Michigan, and a population of right around 600,000 currently. And we've been pretty steady there for the last few years. As far as our population demographics, we're a majority minority city. So when we start getting into our climate planning discussion later, we have a large equity focus there. And similar to many other Midwestern manufacturing cities, we have a very old building stock for the most part. About 70% of our single family and multifamily units were built before 1955, and commercial and industrial sectors are similarly aged pre-1900s to pre-1900s or early 1900s in our downtown area. And then about 42% of the housing units are currently owner occupied, which is right around the national average. Next slide. So for our topics for the day, talking about climate planning and carbon goals. So we've had our sustainability office in place for some time now, and we actually have had a sustainability plan for about 10 years, but we didn't have established carbon reduction goals until just recently. So we had a task force created, that's the City County Task Force on Climate and Economic Equity. And that task force established our community-wide greenhouse gas reduction goals of 45% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050 or sooner. And this is going off of a 2018 baseline. So those weren't necessarily established looking at Milwaukee's specific situation. It was kind of what we've seen other cities do and what's recommended. So the question quickly became, how do we actually reach those goals? So the task force has been working on that throughout 2020 and this year as well, putting together a plan to answer the question of how do we reach our reduction goals with a focus on equity and local job creation. Next slide. So like anybody else going through this process, our starting point was doing our inventory baseline from the 2018 year. So we worked with ICLEI to put this together. And we won't touch on all the topics today since we're here to talk about buildings. But as you can see on the breakout on the right, if you total those all together, it's about 75% is coming from the built environment for Milwaukee. And that's including heating and cooling, electricity generation for those buildings, stationary fuels for those buildings. So it's all encompassing. But obviously, if we're going to reach our goals, this is where we're going to have to do a lot of our work. Next slide. And I think this is one of the more useful graphs that we kind of got out of this initial process is our business as usual projection. So that dashed line that's going horizontally is that 45% goal. The vertical dashed line is 2030. So obviously we need to be at that intersection in less than 10 years now. And obviously all the way to the bottom right by 2050. So I think what this points out is the complexities, looking at the different sectors that we have to have an impact on. And then one of the things that stood out to us also is just the high percentage of emissions coming from stationary fuels for us. So obviously Milwaukee is a cold climate. We have some long and harsh winters, and the heating season is going to be a huge challenge for us of how do we get past say burning stationary fuels and still be able to heat effectively and cost effectively. And then one other thing to point out is you can see the portion of emissions from electricity dropping over time. And that's actually from our utility committing to producing clean energy or generating electricity from clean sources. So that's going to be a big help for us going forward. Next slide. So once we went through our inventory process and kind of that initial projection, we sat down with ICLEI and we wanted to look at what are other cities around the country doing? How are they having success, and how can we duplicate that in Milwaukee? And unfortunately, kind of as we started through that process, we started realizing, hey, we might have some challenges with some of these strategies that are really working for other places. I won't go through all of these, but just as a couple of examples, I mentioned our stationary fuels and heating through winters. Obviously, electrification is a big part of decarbonizing our buildings. But we know with that cold climate, that adds an extra challenge for us, especially when natural gas costs are so low and we'd be asking customers to take on additional costs. So then that brings up other equity issues and all sorts of things. And kind of in the same vein, there's some cities that have a great potential for hydropower, and it's really helped clean their grid. Unfortunately, we don't have a high potential source like that near us. So we have to look outside of that to make sure we're getting renewable energy produced. So that conversation kind of switched from what's working for other places to, let's do an inventory of what we don't have control over and what we can't work on right now, and versus what we can and where we can actually have an impact. Next slide. So just a couple examples of things we don't control. So Wisconsin is a regulated state, so we don't have a choice of where we get our energy. So our utility is still pretty heavily dependent on fossil fuels, about 37% of our energy from coal and 32% from natural gas, and that's for electricity generation as of 2019. I do want to give them credit though, as I mentioned earlier, they set some reduction goals, and actually just earlier this month, they upped those. So they committed to net zero electricity generation by 2050 and 80% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030, which is above and beyond what they already committed to. So that's going to be a big help for us going forward. Next slide. And we have some challenges just with our state regulatory environment as well. So obviously using advanced building codes and energy codes is a great way to make an impact across entire sectors. But unfortunately, adoption and amendment is controlled 100% at the state level in Wisconsin. So cities and municipalities can't set stretch codes or enforce any advanced measures. We're actually going through a review process right now to determine how that might impact benchmarking or high performance standard and how that might fit with that regulatory environment. And actually currently for Wisconsin, we have we're on the 2015 IECC, but one that was adopted was actually amended and stripped all the way down to basically a 2009 level. So we're operating on a code that's a decade out of date already, which is going to greatly inhibit a lot of things, but especially if we start trying to turn the corner towards electrification, if we don't have that tool, it's going to be very difficult. And just another quick example of some regulatory challenges is around renewables. So actually this was a city project. We were slated to install 1 megawatt of solar across 6 city buildings, working with an installer that we were going to do a third-party ownership model. We got through majority of the process, and then when we were submitting paperwork for approval to the utility, it was actually blocked by the utility under the grounds that the installer was acting as a utility because we are a regulated state. So our contractor actually took the utility to court. It's also being reviewed at the PSC level. But if that doesn't advance and end up in our favor, that's really going to be a challenge to make not only for the city to get more renewable energy and rooftop solar, but other businesses and homeowners as well. Next slide. So it's not all doom and gloom, and we can actually do some things to advance our carbon goals. So now we can flip the page to what we've identified as issues we can solve. Next slide. And as Joe mentioned earlier, using the state and local planning for energy tool has been a big part of our planning process going forward, and this far and will be going forward. So he kind of covered this slide, so let's go to the next slide. So some of the questions that SLOPE can answer, and I'm not going to read through all of these, but this is some of the ways that you can use SLOPE to help your climate planning process. So one of the ways we've used it is looking at consumption. So it breaks out electricity and fuel consumption by sector, so residential, commercial, industrial. So you can really get a good sense of where you're going to have the most impact with your strategies. And another one that's actually not listed on here, but it's been very useful, is they have a building count module. So they have an idea of commercial buildings by size and by dollars spent for electricity and energy generation. So that's going to be very helpful for us, again, if we start looking at a benchmarking ordinance or something around our commercial building sector. Next slide. So this is a couple other ways we're using it. So these are all actually specific to Milwaukee. So we were able to drill down to either Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee or Milwaukee County. And one of the ways we're looking at this is using projected levelized cost of energy by technology. And this one's being more of a communication tool. So these are some of the things that working in the industry, you kind of know inherently that our renewable energy is starting to decrease in cost. Fossil fuels are staying pretty steady, but this is a great tool when communicating with the public or with elected officials to show that the renewable energy is going to be the most cost effective moving forward. So you can see the yellows and oranges there are commercial, residential, and utility scale solar. And then the blue line going diagonal is offshore wind, which again, we do have Lake Michigan right next to us. So that's potentially something down the road. And then land-based wind is that actually the lowest line there. So again, it's showing us that this is the most cost-effective way moving forward. Next slide. So one that we've taken great interest in is looking at geothermal potential. And I think, I mentioned earlier the challenges we're going to have with electrifying buildings due to our winters and the heating issues. So the slope module actually shows that Milwaukee County has one of the highest potentials for geothermal heating in the country. So when we saw that, we're like, okay, there has to be something there. We should really start exploring this further. And the graph on the right is actually showing the economic potential. And that big spike in 2028 is when NREL is projecting that there'll be technology changes that will bring down the cost and make it more cost effective. So this is something we're definitely keeping an eye on. We're actually looking now to see if there's some city buildings we could apply this into now and start being a model for others in the community. Next slide. So a couple other ways we're trying to work around these barriers is actually partnering with our utility. So I know we mentioned we're kind of involved with a lawsuit with our utility, but on the other hand, we are trying to work with them because we know we're not going to be able to reach our goals without them. So we actually just recently had a 2.25 megawatt PV system installed within the city. It's the largest in the city of Milwaukee now. We use an existing tariff that the utility had called their Solar Now program. And basically how it works is the utility leases city-owned land. And to build the system, we were able to retain the RECs, and then they actually give us a yearly lease payment that we're rolling into additional climate action each year. So that program was maxed out at the tariff. It can't be used anymore. But the task force thought, we approached the utility with the question of, can we create a new tariff program that's more directly benefiting municipalities? So something that we could work with the utility to build utility scale solar and not have as many hurdles as we needed to cross with the Solar Now program. And actually, they were very amenable to that. So they came back to us and said that's something they'd love to work on. So those discussions and planning is going to be ongoing. We think that's going to be a great tool for us and a great way for us to start increasing the green energy on our grid. Next slide. So I had mentioned, we have a high focus on equity with this plan. And then also, if you recall from the pie chart earlier, the residential sector was actually our highest percentage at 31%. So we have a really big focus on trying to address energy burden in our housing sector. So we know that there's areas of our city that have older housing, and unfortunately those tend to be in minority communities or underserved communities. They might have old housing stock, like I mentioned, or there's just a lack of financing options for low-income families. So we do currently have an ME2 residential financing program, but it's difficult to get the low-income families registered for it or to approve for loans. So we're looking at putting together a new program to specifically benefit low-income families. And again, hopefully we'd be able to partner with the utility and create an on-bill financing model. If we can't do it with the utility, there might be some other ways we could do it. But otherwise, we'd be looking at some other pay-as-you-save method with a revolving loan fund or something like that. So that's in the works and will be a big focus on our climate plan. On the flip side of that, we're actually also looking at a new construction program for housing. And it kind of became clear that there's areas where retrofit either isn't cost effective or you're really not going to be able to get an efficient home because the house is beyond that. And there also are some vacant lots still within the city. So wanted to find a way to create infill housing that's going to be net zero or near net zero. And we've kind of found out that through modular design and construction that we can actually maintain the affordability that would make it achievable for lower income families. And the plan would be to have them actually manufactured at a factory in the city of Milwaukee. So we're working on that currently. And the idea there is obviously you're reducing transportation emissions because it's constructed locally, but also we're creating green jobs, and we'd have requirements on to hire local workers that are in underserved communities, again, addressing the equity issues that we have. And we're actually working closely with the Department of Energy on that project through the Advanced Building Construction Group and then the Workforce Accelerator as well. Next slide. So one other thing that we kind of realized going through this process is, given the current regulatory environment, we won't be able to reach our goals. I mean, we can make progress, but unless things change at the state level, we're going to have a really hard time achieving our 2030 and our 2050 goals. So this is, so this year, Milwaukee joined 5 cities and 2 counties to create the Wisconsin Local Government Climate Coalition. And it's modeled after a group in Colorado that did something similar. But the idea is to jointly advocate for climate policy at the state level. So we kind of have a wish list of policies that we think are needed for cities to meet their climate goals. And we'll do things like file comments and intervene on PSC cases and lobby with legislators to try and get some change. And I do want to give some credit to the state as well, because at the end of last year, the Governor's Task Force on Climate Change released their first climate change report. Again, it was the first of its kind in Wisconsin. They went through a whole planning process in 2020, meeting with stakeholders around the state. And there's all the recommendations in this report align very closely with the things that we would ask for the Wisconsin Local Government Climate Coalition. So it's right on the same page as what we think we need to move forward. And now we're at the point where the report's released, we know the state government's on board. We just need the legislature to start, kind of following in line as well. So, and again, just reiterate, we know we're not going to be able to do it alone. So we're having a focus on partnering with utility, the state, and other entities to get the job done. And that's it. Next slide.
Good stuff. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate the transparency and candor there, and that's great. We have a lot of good questions coming in for you. Our tech support people have informed me that some people are asking their questions in the wrong session. There's a different session called Pathways to Community Resilience. They both start with pathway, but that's not our session. So if you asked a question there, go back to this session, which is called Pathways to Zero, and ask your question again, please. Just want to make sure we don't miss any of those. So now we're going to transition from the local government to the commercial real estate lens here. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Landau, who's the head of ESG at MetLife Investment Management. He's got a wealth of experience in asset management, both at MetLife and at Bentall Kennedy. And as part of his leadership in ESG, Jim founded the Met Zero program, which is probably one of the coolest names in the space, to define and achieve carbon neutrality for several of MetLife's real estate funds. So Jim, over to you.
Hey, thank you, Joe. Appreciate and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this panel. Really briefly, go to the next slide. This is a little bit on MetLife. So MetLife has a corporate sustainability team that covers our offices around the world. I'm not part of that, although we work closely with them. I'm part of MetLife Investment Management. So we manage the real estate investments, that MetLife's balance book. We've been investing in real estate for over 145 years. For the majority of that time, we were investing our own money and owning assets outright. Over the last decade or so, we've really transitioned to an advisor, an asset manager. So obviously, we still have MetLife investments that we're managing, but we're now advising and managing assets for domestic and international pension funds and life companies, sovereign wealth funds, and others. Both as where our own money is involved, as well as an advisor on the separate account side. A couple of things. So we have about $125 billion in investments within the real estate and agricultural finance group that I oversee from an ESG perspective. And that's about 25 billion in real estate equity, about over 70 billion in commercial mortgage loans. In a typical year, we put out about 12 to 14 billion dollars in new commercial mortgage loans. And that's our equity is US only, our loan program is international. And then we've got over $20 billion in agricultural finance, which is all debt. And interestingly, and I'm learning a lot about this over the last year or so since I started in this new role, but it's remarkable what we can do from an agricultural perspective in terms of the loans that we're managing. And it's not my focus of the panel today, but we've got a several $billion timber portfolio, the majority of which is certified through one of 3 sustainable forestry initiatives. We're very involved in water conservation and working with our borrowers to improve water conservation. So really interesting and area where I hope to spend a bit more of my time. And just finishing up on our portfolio. So we've got, on the equity side, we've got over 60 million square feet of real estate. That's heavily, the majority of that is in office and industrial property. We also have a fair amount of retail. And that 60 million square feet doesn't include about 20,000 multifamily residential units that we own and over 10,000 hotel keys that we own all in the US. So the one thing that I want to focus on this slide right here is that what you see in the bottom there, 3 funds are participating in the Net Zero program. So we really started this in 2020. And over the last year, year to maybe a little over a year, we've really put together the program, formulated it. I'll talk a little bit more about the boundaries and how we're doing this and what we're looking at as we go on. But we specifically are holding back from rolling it out to other funds. We wanted to get our ducks in a row, get our GHG tracker built, figure out really what's our what are our boundaries and how we go about this. And, because at the end of the day, we don't want to just do this to do it. We want to do it to be successful and to reduce carbon, right? That's really the goal here. And I will say that as we are actively involved in talking with new investors in our open-end diversified core equity fund, or Odyssey fund, or new managed account or separate account partners, both domestically in the U.S. as well as in Europe, they're very interested in what we're doing here. And while returns are, obviously always are and will always be a key aspect of what advisors and asset managers they choose to work with, how we get there and how we manage our assets and our portfolio, how we're dealing with carbon in particular, is something that the majority of them are all very interested in and really want to talk about, at length, which is exciting for me. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I'm going to focus one thing. You can read this, but on the third bullet, regulatory risk protection. So this is something that I think we all certainly in the commercial real estate industry are thinking a lot about. New York's got its local law 97. Washington D.C. has its energy law. City of St. Louis, Washington State, coming soon to a city near you, certainly Boston and others. Other carbon laws and energy laws. Over the next several years, you're going to need to reduce your emissions, or you're going to pay a penalty, at least in many of the primary, markets where at least certainly MetLife, is active. In addition, we believe that, it's only a matter of time before the U.S. has a carbon tax, federal carbon tax. There are carbon taxes in Canada and elsewhere around the world. They're gaining momentum in terms of the amount of the tax. We think it's likely that we will have a carbon tax in the U.S. at some point in time. We've done some back of the envelope math, and today, don't quote me on this, but a $50 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent tax could result in an increase in utility costs of give or take 20%. That's not insignificant. Those costs would probably be put on the suppliers of energy and passed through to the customers. So by reducing energy, reducing emissions today, and having a program over the next several years, you really position yourself better to deal with the influx of state and city laws and the potential for federal taxes and that sort of thing. So it's not just good real estate. It's not just good today. It's smart, long-term type of strategy. Next slide, Kyle. This is not something new. We've put a name to it, carbon cascade, but this is really, and this is going to look familiar to many of you. And by the way, it's also just slightly similar to one of the slides that Matt used in his presentation. Different categories, but similar concept. So we use the word tranches because we're an investment advisor and it's a business and people understand that. So we try and talk in terms that folks understand. Folks that we talk to. Tranche one, energy efficiency. Always the most important approach. Always the most important factor. It's an old cliche. It's becoming an old cliche, but the cheapest kilowatt to offset is the one you don't use in the first place. And I'll talk a little bit more in the presentation about how we're working not only to deal with energy efficiency in what we manage and control, but also within 10 premises. Tranche two, on-site renewables, solar, clearly the most, what we talk about most today, prices have obviously come down and become much more efficient and cost effective over the last decade. I think that's going to continue. We're currently working on, have completed or are working on what will amount to probably about 4 megawatts of power over the next in the next 18 months or so. And we want to continue that and grow it. We're also working on new development guidelines. We're involved in a lot of new development. I'm in DC, by the way, and just in DC, we've got over $1 billion of development in 3 mixed-use projects. Clearly thinking about energy efficiency and including on-site renewables is more efficient if you build it in at the outset than if you try and add it later. You can add it later, particularly something like solar, but there are other technologies. And I also want to add that technology is moving quickly, and what's viable today what may not seem viable today may seem viable a year from now or 2 years from now. We also believe, and we track through some technology committees that we have in-house, that technology is going to grow dramatically over the next several years. And we believe it's going to be necessary to take advantage of these advances in technology to achieve our goals long term. So we're open to everything that's coming down the pike. Tranche 3, offsite renewable energy, purchasing green power, VPPAs, and other techniques. Finally, you come to tranches 4 and 5. That's RECs and offsets. The goal is to reduce the amount that we need to pay for RECs and offsets by reducing our net emissions through tranches 1, 2, and 3. I have another slide it's not in the deck today, but it's a simple graph. It's very similar to Matt, a slide that you showed over between today and 2050, and it essentially shows that tranches 1, 2, and 3 are going to grow year by year, thereby reducing the amount on a same-store basis that we need to spend on RECs and offsets. I want to add that from an institutional real estate perspective, we think it's going to be really hard to achieve true net zero. Okay, on our industrial buildings and retail buildings, sure, that's probably feasible over time. On a mid-rise, high-rise, multifamily or urban office building, that's going to be pretty difficult. So reducing emissions and doing everything we can is really how we're going to make an impact. Next slide. The one thing I'm going to focus on this slide is the third area, all tenant controlled energy consumption. So one of the things that we did in putting together our program, and just so that it's clear, we actually work with Joe Invic and his team at RETEC on our program, and they've done a great job, and we're really thankful for the partnership that we've had with them. One of the first things that we had to do when we started was determine what are our boundaries. What is it that we want to track in terms of our emissions, and what is it that we want to, at the end of the day, offset? And we made the decision to include all tenant premises. That makes it difficult, partly because we don't control those premises, our tenants do. Partly, we don't design them and we don't operate them. And in many cases, we don't even have the data. What we've discovered over the last year of building our program is that, and I found this shocking, honestly, that we don't have close to 70% of the data of our overall buildings, and that's tenant control data. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in a future slide about how we're trying to address that. But the key here is you need to think about what your long-term goal is. I encourage stretch goals, and then figure out how you're going to get there, knowing that it's going to take time, and you're going to have to build it. You're going to need a lot of cooperation from all participants. Matt made that clear. But I've got a Matt, one of the points that you made, in working with the solar project and the utility. So we've got a over 500 kilowatt rooftop array that we put up here in a building in DC. It's been complete for a number of months now, and we're still working through utility issues. We had utility interconnection approval 2 years ago. The bar has changed, and it's frustrating. That's ready to be turned. It's been ready to be flipped on, if you will, for 4 months now, and we're still working on it. So don't be frustrated by these hiccups and bumps in the road. Next slide, Kyle. I'm not going to go over each one of these, and I've really started to address them. GHG inventory, whether you do it, on an, with the help of Energy Star and an Excel, use a product off the shelf that's available out there. You need to figure out how you track your GHG inventory. ECM, energy conservation measures. We've all been doing this for many years. We've really upped up our game, through the Med Zero program, and it's very important. Looking at the next line, business planning. We're a budget-driven entity, and we work with our money, MetLife's money, and our partners' money, and we have to think long term. So we're always planning, at least 5 years in advance. You need to be thinking about what can you do and start allocating and budgeting those dollars, today, so that you're in position to move forward with projects tomorrow. Solar energy I touched on, green power procurement. We engaged with a company, Resource Energy, recently to create a national energy procurement program, at least in deregulated states. We're moving forward with that, and we're buying green power, 100% renewable electricity in most instances at this point. Tenant partners programs. This is what I wanted to talk about a little bit before. We don't have a lot of tenant data, and we're going to need to work with tenants to really achieve our goals. So we're using our program. We sent out surveys actually at the end of the year to all the tenants in the programs that are participating in Med Zero. And we asked them questions such as, are you interested in talking to a landlord about improving efficiency within your premises? Not that we're going to pay our dollars to do it, but we've got expertise, and we've got expert third-party managers that can help out. And we had great response. At least 50% of the respondents said, yes, I'd like to talk to a landlord about this, as well as other things like participating in the Energy Star for Tenants program. So working with your tenants is critical. Last slide, please. Very quickly, the bottom right, we're working on a series of white papers right now on carbon neutrality. The first one should be published hopefully in the next couple of weeks on our website. And we're going to, we have others that were coming later this year as we move closer to the COP26 conference in Glasgow this November. We think that the world is going to, potentially move the targets and milestones that were set in Paris in 2015. And then finally, embodied versus operational carbon. Everything we're talking about deals with operational carbon. So we're starting the process of thinking about, particularly in our new developments, of course, how can we address embodied carbon? How can we track it, and how can we reduce it over time? So a lot of challenges in the future, and look forward to any questions that you guys have, after the last presentation. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Jim. Really appreciate it. So I see a lot of good questions continuing to come in. Keep them coming, and keep upvoting the questions that you want to see asked. We'll be able to get through probably 5 or 6 of them at the end here. I'm going to hand it over to Mark now. So Mark joined TNDC in 2020 as the Director of Facilities. He's got over 30 years of experience in facilities operations, management, and maintenance. And he's created and implemented facilities and sustainability programs within the semiconductor, software, government, education, transportation, and commercial real estate sectors. So Mark, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Hey, thank you so much for that introduction, Joe. I feel like I should be holding a Golden Globe Award and thanking my parents. Anyways, hey, before we get started, I want to give a shout out to 2 people within TNDC that really were the ground foot soldiers driving sustainability efforts. First is our former senior sustainability manager, who's moved on to bigger and better things, Ruchi Shah. And second is our sustainability coordinator, Magdalena Shizmanska. The dynamic duo of sustainability with TNDC drove a lot of the successes we've had at this point. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about TNDC. So our theory of change, our ultimate goal, is that people with low income have access to equitable housing in a community that provides for them the resources they need to thrive in a neighborhood. So that's our core goal and our core mission. Our work supports 5,800 tenants, 43 buildings, 4,000 homes, and 7 different neighborhoods within the San Francisco area. Next slide, please. So let's kind of give you a TNDC at a glance. We're a nonprofit organization. We fight for housing. We believe housing is a human right, but housing isn't where our work stops. As we'll find out with our sustainability efforts in terms of healing the planet, healing our neighborhoods, healing our communities. That includes the people that live in those communities as well and the needs that they have. So as we're looking at that, we have after school programs, we have people's gardens, we have rooftop gardens, we have a lot of different programs that help our low-income residents. Out of our 4,100 residents, 3,280 of them make less than $15,000 a year. So I don't know if any of you can survive off $15,000 a year, but I can't, and we're happy to be able to provide housing for those who are in that income bracket. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's get into what the nuts and bolts of this whole thing. So these are the values for the facilities department, which I run, and they align with the values of TNDC as a whole. And I want to read these to you because these are important. We'll start with homes. Facilities provide support and programs that help create and maintain homes for our growing community. Let's skip over to voice. This is also important. Facilities is committed to hearing the voices of all people under our care, employees and tenants alike. We look for and solicit feedback to enable us to respond to concerns quickly and ensure needs are met. And then I'm going to go to health, which ties this all together. Facilities supports the health of our buildings by incorporating green technologies and ensuring the safety and physical conditions of each property. It was important to incorporate sustainability and green technologies into our facilities values because that translates back into the voice and to the homes. Next slide, please. Okay, so our sustainability goals are common, and you've seen these repeated, and they're repeated for a reason because these are the goals that people should be having, and they work. So energy and water, and this is all based on compared to a 2019 baseline. We reached a goal in 2019, and now we're continuing to set new goals. So our new goal is reducing 20% of our energy and water by 2029, increasing waste diversion to 60%, same time period. Operational carbon, we want to reduce combined scope 1 and 2 emissions by 50%. And we want to incorporate solar PV to support a minimum of 30% of the building's energy use. We also want to leverage green certification. This is important because folks have done studies, folks have put up things that you need to meet, and green certification is one of those. So we want to meet either a Green Point Platinum rated, LEED Gold. We also consider the occupant-based health approaches such as Living Building Challenge, Fitwell, and Well. So all these goals combine to kind of have a holistic view of how sustainability impacts the people in the communities, the health of the people, the health of the community, and the health of the neighborhood. Next slide, please. So our pathways to low carbon, Jim, this is this is almost a mirror of what your slide was. Same sort of things, same initiatives, and we're all going to share a lot of these same initiatives. But I want to talk about energy efficiency. And Jim, you talked about energy efficiency as well, being a very important aspect of this. So other than just the ultra efficient equipment that we should be looking for, Energy Star rated equipment, and as a multifamily housing, when we're looking at washers and dryers, and we're looking at dishwashers, we're looking at these types of appliances that we put in, we look for the most efficient that we can afford to put in. But I also want to stress that operational and building management practices are just as important when we're talking about recommissioning work, when we're talking about a PM program, predictive maintenance, a robust inspection program. Your equipment will lose efficiency over time if it isn't properly maintained. So it's important to have that robust program, a work order system that captures this, a planner scheduler that sets the program parameters. These are really important aspects to maintain energy efficiency. It's not just putting in the equipment, it's really about a robust maintenance program to make sure that happens. Next slide, please. All right, so when we look at new construction, all electric isn't always expensive. So there was a study done, and it was done by the Department of Environment in San Francisco and a power company. And what they found is that a change in construction costs, and I won't read all the numbers here, but if you plan early, and this you see in the what not to do, switch to all electric late design, that's something that you want to do when you see a plot of land. I'm going to build a building and I'm going to make it electric. So you want to start that process at the beginning. That's what we found. it becomes more expensive, a lot more expensive when you try to do it later on in design. It's best to make the decision to go electrification at the beginning. And then it also, when they did a net present value analysis, they also realized that it is a good investment over the long haul to have an electrified building. In the what to do, I want to kind of comment on, I can't see the whole thing here. So we want to set clear goals and get buy-in from all. Now, getting buy-in from all, part of sustainability is about new technologies, and new technologies are about change, and change is difficult for a lot of people, especially when they're putting money on the line. So making the sale is just as important as finding the product and doing everything else. Buy-in is extremely important. And as Jim mentioned about going after the tenants and getting their buy-in and getting their participation, we too have tenants that we need to bring in and get buy-in for them to participate in the overall sustainability efforts. And then there's another bit underneath that, evaluate on-site renewable options. It's called commissioning. I can't stress commissioning enough. Commissioning helps us make sure that the equipment we're putting in is operating up to spec. It's extremely important. It's well worth the dollars spent, and it'll have a payback very quickly. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is very quick. These are the programs that were leveraged in order to get the rebates and incentives to allow us to have the money and funding to be able to do the sustainability work we've done. And a lot of these will probably be familiar to you folks. But looking ahead, we're now looking at a solar plus storage system to build resiliency within our buildings, remove diesel generators that offer backup power. We run senior buildings, disabled senior buildings. They have medicines, they have things like that. So when we have, as climate change is starting to impact fires and power outages and things like that in California, it's important for us to have that resiliency built in, and we want to do it in a sustainable manner. So we're looking at the SGIP program, and there's some bureaucracy that's been brought up. Matthew brought up some of the bureaucracy. That's been some of our main stumbling blocks with the SGIP program is the bureaucracy behind it. And they're trying to figure out tariff rates and whether multifamily is a commercial or a residential rate. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be worked out. That's where we look to our partners to help us work that out. Our partners within the Department of Energy, our partners within the Department of Environment, and gathering those fine minds together to help solve these issues. Next slide, please. Okay, so we did a partial electrification case study as part of our overarching goals and sustainability efforts. And we picked this building. It was 1190 Howard Street, a multifamily building at 88 SRO studio units, 74 family units, 162 units total, 5 floors, first floor commercial, and a boiler room on the ground floor. Okay, let's go next slide. So what did we have? We had 2 independent gas-fired systems, a domestic hot water system, 2 boilers, and a heating hot water system, 2 boilers, non-condensing boilers, low efficiency gas systems. So we took those out and we did one combination system where we put in a heat pump water heater with a heat exchanger tied into 2 heating hot water boilers that are high efficiency gas units that are condensing boilers. The heat exchanger provides, so the heat pump provides 80% of the domestic hot water load. The heat exchanger provides the rest. And we have fully redundant systems for both domestic hot water and heating hot water. Next slide, please. Okay, so the entire scope of work for all the projects we've done to get us to the point where we're at today, and we're continuing to invest in new projects. We have a solar project going on right now at another one of our buildings, our Rosa Parks facility. That's the building we're looking to employ our first battery backup system. But when you look at all these scopes of work, the low flow aerators in unit LED lighting, common area and exterior LEDs, and variable drives, and retro commissioning, and hot water heating pipe installation, all these efforts combine to give us these projected savings in energy and cost and reduction of metric tons of CO2. But I want to stress that this is just part of the physical structure work. There's also other work that we as sustainability managers and people who are fighting the fight of climate change need to keep in mind. And as a multifamily housing provider, we also look at holistically how the impact on the community plays into this. So we need to look at how do we integrate nature into our society and our urban society, because it's the lack and the decimation of our natural lands that are really exacerbating this problem. So it's important to look at how all of this plays into play. So if I have a community of people who have a lack of education opportunities, a lack of healthcare opportunities, a lack of job opportunities, these things impact us on an environmental level. If I have employees that are driving in 3 hours a day to work because they can't afford housing where they work, that impacts our environmental objectives holistically as a whole. So you can't just look at putting solar on a building. You have to look at the entirety of your program, the entirety of your organization, and really start to look where you can start pulling stuff out. So I think that, I want to leave you with that focusing on people is focusing on sustainability as well. I'd like to go to my next slide, my last slide, because this is important. So we're all kind of warriors in the climate change battle that we're all facing here. So we're really the superheroes trying to save the planet, if we really look at it. Our collective home, in essence, our very survival. So we need to stop focusing on ROI as just money. We need to start looking at what is the return on investment in terms of quality of life, return on investment in terms of the health of us, of our society, of our communities, of our local neighborhoods, and of our neighbors and of ourselves. The ROI isn't just about money. It's about the planet, it's about the environment we're living in, and it's about the quality of life at work and at home. And so when she says, Greta Thunberg, we all know who she is, I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic and act as if the house was on fire. And that's an appropriate statement for what we're looking at in terms of how we approach this. So we at TNDC take this very seriously, and we look at all these different aspects of sustainability and the impacts of not performing sustainability actions, as well as the impacts of performing sustainability action. What are the risks of not doing this work is just as much a part of the sell of what are the risks of doing this work. And so when you're building your business cases for new technologies or you're asking for a lot of money, put this together and say, here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to save our environment, and here's the payback for that effort. Yes, your money may be 6 years in an ROI, and a lot of this, you'll see a 6-year ROI on, and a lot of CEOs, a lot of accountants don't like a 6-year ROI. They want a 2-year or less ROI. And so we have to find new ways to sell this initiative and get people on board with the concept that sustainability isn't just about saving money. It's really about saving our environment. And with that, I'm looking forward to a Q&A session, a very robust Q&A session.
Awesome. Thank you all. Not only was that one of my favorite sessions at the summit so far, you also all came in under time. So we have lots and lots of time for Q&A, which is amazing. So we got 30 minutes here, lots of good questions coming in, no shortage of tricky ones and interesting ones. So we're going to have a nice long conversation here. I'm going to open this first one up to everybody. And this is the top voted question, I think, for good reason. And the question is, our local government is in the infancy stage of thinking about net zero and carbon goals related to buildings. I'd love to hear how you get buy-in from stakeholders that are only concerned about the financial bottom line and not climate goals. And I have a separate flip side question about how you make the financial case after this one. But yeah, how do you get people online when they've got 2-year payback thresholds and not particularly interested in anything else?
Well, I would say for local governments, I think that payback threshold, it gets stretched out a little bit longer. I think we have the benefit of looking at paybacks as a long-term. 2 years is great, but when you're a local government that's planning on being there for a while, 10 years is fine, and you can make that work into your budget. And every year your operating costs are dropping when you make these investments. And I also say that the good thing now is as technology advances, that ROI is becoming stronger. I mean, with both energy efficiency, renewables, and everything, all of the above, especially when you start pairing those together. So I think there is a financial case to make, and if that's what language those people are speaking, then make sure you have that ready to go. And I would just say the flip side of it, which Mark touched on, is including other benefits or finding what else speaks to those stakeholders, whether it's equity issues, community development issues, job creation. There's so many things that are affected by these investments that I think you can spin the story the right way for who you're talking to and sell it that way.
Yeah, and I would add to that we also need to look at how we can leverage the free market to reduce the cost of new technologies that'll help our ROI be shorter, to what Matthew was saying. So there are ways. I mean, the free market will, I think, help us start driving these costs down. As regulations start pouring in and creating the need, I believe that the free market will respond to that need, and we'll start getting more and more products available and more competition within the marketplace. But we need to drive competition in the marketplace for sustainability efforts. And as that competition grows, and it's growing rapidly, we're going to start seeing those prices come down, just like we're seeing in solar, like as Jim had alluded to in his presentations. It is coming down. We need to keep driving it down. And by driving it down, we create demand, we create competition, and we should start seeing some better ROIs in terms of financial aspect. But I would continue to emphasize that ROI is not just about money, and we need to start identifying other types of returns on our investment that is not just monetarily.
I would add one last thing, and I touched on this in my comments earlier. Transition risk, state, city laws, federal carbon tax, et cetera, is coming. And today, purchasing RECs and offsets is actually really, really cheap. It's remarkably cheap. You can buy national RECs today for a little over $3 per kilowatt, and that's up actually significantly from pre-Texas disaster in December. Mm. But over the next 10 years, there are predictions that RECs could go to $20, $25, $30 per kilowatt. So 10 times what they cost today. So if you think about reducing your emissions today, not just based on the ROI that you're going to look at today, but based on the risk that you have, 5 years, 10 years down the road, you need to take that into consideration.
Well, that's an excellent point, Jim.
Yeah, the cost per megawatt on RECs, although just to make sure, Jim, has been pretty dirt cheap for the last, even though it's fluctuated a lot for the last couple, the last decade, frankly. But yes, most analyses seem to indicate it's likely on an upward trajectory as the demand increases. The only thing I would add is, we work on designing a lot of carbon neutrality and carbon reduction programs, and I think one theme that you saw from all three of these organizations is that sort of prioritized waterfall, cascade, whatever you want to call it, but that prioritized way of thinking about investments. Really what that is it's ultimately a bundling strategy. It's saying, let's think about the ROI of our entire carbon reduction program together as a bundled investment, because you might have some 2-year payback LED projects, and you might have to pay a little extra for green power. But if you think about it all collectively, a lot of times you can achieve pretty significant and deep carbon reductions where the higher payback retrofits or projects sort of subsidize the lower payback ones. Same thing on green power, right? Sometimes if you're switching to a centralized green power procurement model, you might be paying a little bit more per kilowatt hour for the green power, but you can also sometimes achieve cost savings by renegotiating your utility contracts or getting in a better rate category, whatever it might be. So I think the bundling is something that all you are pretty sophisticated about thinking about it that way. And I think we have to sort of get away from this idea of thinking about ROI as a project by project metric.
Yeah, totally agree.
Okay, great. So another good question down here. Hold on a second. Well, kind of the flip side to that, and maybe we've already covered some of this, but we had one question here that I think is a good issue to flag. They said, we have yet to hear meaningful discussion about how to overcome payback issues. Solar's best payback is 6 years without incentives. Businesses won't typically accept anything over 2, although I'm not sure I agree with that, but curious on your folks' thoughts on that. Wind is also highly subsidized. So who bears these hidden costs, and what's the sort of payback realities here when we talk about carbon neutrality?
I'll start. I mean, it depends on where you're. It depends on where you're located. And I don't think I'm telling anybody anything here that's new news. California, Massachusetts, New York, a handful of New Jersey, are jurisdictions where solar is more economical. Partly because of the spark spread the cost, of power versus the cost to produce power, as well as local incentives. There's also the, considerations like the investment tax credit, which is going to step down over the years. So, my suggestion would be, if you've got property in one of those areas, again, California, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, a couple others, every property that you have in those jurisdictions you should be looking at solar right today. Focus all your energy there. If you don't have assets in those locations, then it's not going to be as economical.
Then I would just add that there's different financing methods to look at for this as well. And obviously coming from a government perspective, it's not as much of an impact on us, but like mentioned in my introduction, managing a PACE program, financing it through PACE, you don't have an upfront cost. You're seeing operational savings from reduced energy every year. There's ways to change that through financing that's going to make that more palatable for any business.
Great. We'll have a couple of rapid fire questions for each of you individually here, and then we'll go back to some group questions. So for Milwaukee to start with, one person was asking what technological advancements are most critical for you in making geothermal heating more cost effective. But I'd be interested in you answering that question more broadly. Sort of what are the 2 or 3 technological advancements over the next 10 or 20 years that you think are going to be most important to help Milwaukee hit your carbon goals?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things, and those are kind of in the same vein, but both geothermal heat pumps and also air source heat pumps. I know there's a lot of discussion on whether they're viable in cold climates. Some might be down to -10, something like that. Well, we tend to beat that every once in a while here. So, as those just become more efficient and able to operate in colder temperatures, air source heat pumps are hopefully something we can rely on. I think as far as geothermal, the big cost with geothermal is, trenching, drilling, and putting in the system. So as technology advances in that way, hopefully the installation cost starts to drop. I think that's hopefully where something will change. But also just more efficient systems as motors become more efficient. Different things that are just going to drive the efficiency of the system up, which makes that payback a little bit quicker.
Awesome. And a question from Mark. So the person said, 100% agree on the importance of maintenance. Do you have a method for estimating the savings impact from green operations and maintenance?
Well, when we trend our energy usage, we'll start a baseline trend at the beginning. So as I take over in a property or whatever, industrial complex or whatever, we start with a baseline. We need to understand where we are. And then through retro commissioning, through maintenance procedures, we can start measuring the reduction. A lot of times we'll do it to the equipment level where we'll monitor and start trending data. It's all about the data that you gather. So we'll put CTs on our electrical equipment. We'll put flow meters. We'll understand first, measure what we have. You can't manage what you don't measure. And then you can start making the progress changes from there. But it's really about collecting the right data at the front end so that you know where you're headed from there. You compare that to nameplate data. You get your equipment in top operating positions. So if I'm pulling 2 amps more on a motor than I should be pulling for that service, I know that I need to either replace that motor or I need to service that motor, get it rewound, or whatever I need to do to increase the efficiency of that motor. Then I can take that data that's trending and also bring that back in. Also, new technologies minimize maintenance, right? LED lights, for instance. So there's a cost save, back to the ROI, there's a cost save for maintenance on some of the new technologies that you put in are actually less maintenance intensive. But for the air handling equipment, for the pumps, for the industrial equipment, it's really about managing your data, capturing the data with a control system. And I'm big, part of the initiative that we're doing right now within TNDC is building the infrastructure, the base foundation of control systems for all these buildings. A lot of multifamily housing, they don't have control systems in the buildings. So how do you aggregate that data to make smart business decisions or smart maintenance decisions? So really, I would say the start here is to gather your data, start measuring your usage at the equipment level, put that into a control system so you can start trending that data. Then you have a baseline to work from to start the process of either recommissioning or enhancing your preventive maintenance program, and also looking at predictive maintenance technologies as well. Control system can help you really fine tune a predictive maintenance program, and a planner scheduler is absolutely necessary for a large organization to have a quality PM program. But all that data that comes in, then you analyze that data, and that helps you make the right decisions moving forward.
Great answer. Thank you, Mark. And a question for Jim. So folks were interested to hear more when you said that all tenant spaces are included in Net Zero for participating funds. Folks had some questions about that. So one question was, if you're a building owner, which you are, and you have tenants with a triple net lease that will not run out for the next, say, 5 years. So by triple net, they mean, of course, that the tenant's responsible for their own utility bills. How would you encourage your tenant to go about doing Net Zero? How would you engage a tenant where you have basically no operational control over what they're doing?
Good question. And, I started to address it a little bit in talking about the tenant partners program that we've created and we're rolling out. I mean, communication with tenants is one thing. One thing that we recognized over the last year as we started to build this program was, we've got goals. And by the way, it's I think this is obvious. It's critical to not only have goals, but to publish them, because it keeps you honest. But we have goals, we have carbon goals, and we put them on our website. You can go see them. Our tenants have goals too, and it's remarkable how easy it is to find out about it. You could ask them. You could also just go to their website. A lot of our tenants are large national law firms, engineering firms, high tech firms, and if you just go to their website and Google sustainability carbon, you find their goals. That enables a conversation. Hey, tenant, this is the landlord. I want to talk to you about your goals and how we can help you to reach them, right? There's nothing like conversation to create value and to create trust. So you have to start somewhere, and it's not always that hard. The other thing is lease structure. You need to have a lease, and if you've got an existing tenant, that at least 5 years ago, that maybe this is tough, but you need to have a lease structure that allows you to share costs. So one of the things, for instance, that we're doing is, particularly in industrial and retail buildings, we're putting in the lease that we have the right to put solar on the roof and to provide power to the tenant. Okay, so that we don't have to go to them and ask for permission, at a later date. You need to think through some of these things in advance a little bit. You could require that a tenant, again, in a lease, to buy green power. You could work with a tenant to educate their employees, and by the way, their employees they're sustainable. They drive, electric cars, and, they recycle at home, and they want to be, they want their company to be, follow suit. So if you're providing a better workplace, better lighting, better air quality, et cetera, it's good for the companies, because 90% of their cost is payroll, not occupancy costs. So work with them. One other idea is, and I heard this on another panel that, a number of months ago, I thought it was brilliant, and we haven't really done anything with it yet, but create a baseline for carbon. So let's say, triple net lease, tenant is, say in the lease, tenant, you're using, we anticipate you're going to use this much power, it's going to create this much carbon, this much emissions. If you go above that, you've got to pay for RECs, the cost of RECs, to offset that additional. I'm not saying that could work. It may not work today, and maybe it works in a year or two, but you need to think out of the box a little bit, and those are just a couple of ideas.
That's great. Matt, I'm particularly curious to hear on the subject of sort of community and stakeholder engagement, since your targets span not just city operations, but also are like looking to the community for emissions reductions as well. What are you guys thinking are going to be some of your key traction points, I guess, with getting driving behavior change or investment in the private sector within Milwaukee? And you mentioned financing programs in particular. I'd be curious to hear more about that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a big challenge, a big part of our planning process. So the way our task force is set up, we have work groups, and there is one that's specifically designed for community outreach, education, and kind of workshopping those things with the community. So we know we need community buy-in kind of on the outset of this plan, or it's going to make it that much more difficult. But I think part of it that's helpful is, some of the relationships we have with the business community already through the PACE program that I mentioned, or the Better Buildings Challenge that we did in conjunction with the Department of Energy. So we have a good network of organizations that are developers, business owners, that have these same goals or will have these same goals. So it's working with them on the front end, let them know what we're thinking and what potential ordinances or things are coming down the road, and kind of working with them to put those things together rather than passing it and saying, all right, well, now it's your job to figure it out. So I think having those conversations early on, because if you have a small subset of business owners and building owners that are bought into it and can kind of start achieving those goals early on, it makes it really a lot more easy to point to them as success cases and show how it can happen.
Great. So back to a couple of general questions here. I think this is a good one. And so the question is, so if you were, let's say you were approached by or talking to an organization that was purchasing renewable energy certificates and offsets and saying they're carbon neutral, not really focusing on energy efficiency, renewable energy, green power procurement, the other sort of Jim's tranches 1, 2, and 3, or the first three of the 4 on Mark's Waterfall. Right. What would you say to an organization that's doing that? Is that enough? What should they be doing more? How would you approach that conversation? Assuming it's a
Can I go first on this one?
Example. Go for it, Mark.
I would say you're not doing enough, period. That's one aspect of it. But if we ignore the whole, like I mentioned in my presentation, we need to look at sustainability holistically. Look, when I bring in a new engineer and I'm training them on a building, for instance, I equate the building to the human body because we build for humans. So a building breathes like we breathe, it pumps fluids like we pump fluids, it has a brain, a DDC system is its brain, it has an electrical system, which is our nervous system. And so we don't look at our body just at one component. We need to take care of our body holistically. The same thing with a building. When we put in a new piece of technology, we can't just look at that piece of technology, we need to look at it holistically. And so you translate that up to a community-wide holistic approach to sustainability efforts. And like I was saying in the beginning, during my presentation, was that you can't just look at one aspect of sustainability and think you're doing your part. This is really a battle to save our environment, which we happen to need to survive. And so the urgency is important. So I would say to that company, thank you for doing something. Here's what else you need to start doing immediately, because we don't have the luxury of generations to solve this problem. And I think we see that in the graph that Matt showed. I think it was you, Matt, that showed how or maybe it was Jim, how more investments are coming. Maybe it was you, Joe, actually, I'm getting so mixed up. But the point is that more investments, more companies, more Fortune 500 companies, that was the slide, are starting to make those commitments. Those commitments are important. So I would tell them very bluntly, you need to do more. It's your responsibility to do more for your community and for your employees, for yourself, and for the planet. That's my soapbox speech anyways.
And I would just say too that, I mean, at that point you might be saying you're carbon neutral, but you're missing out on the actual return on investment that you would be getting from doing things on site. And what Jim just touched on, the environmental benefits of it in the building, of better airflow, better lighting, tenant satisfaction, all those things that go into that. And then not to mention, if you're doing a PPA from wind energy that's in Texas and you're located in Wisconsin, for example, you're not helping emissions in your community and you're not reducing emissions that's going to impact the health of your community and wellness of your community. So I think that's the way to look at it is, what can you do to impact the people around you in your building, your community, and at that level first before, looking to other sources.
And I'll just conclude with, look from the perspective of an institutional investor who's got, who's always leasing space to other people, right? It's short-sighted because, I've mentioned this already, our tenants, whether they're office, multifamily, hotel, gas, retail, industrial, whatever, they all care about, these issues today, and they're going to care even more tomorrow. And if we're not doing the right thing, then, by operating our buildings well, then they're going to go somewhere else to lease space. So, you're going to You're going to lose occupancy, you're going to lose rate, you're going to lose value. So it would be short-sighted.
And I will say, and again, wearing my consulting hat, not my DOE hat here, that it's been interesting to watch, particularly in the investment realm, how much more specific and more sophisticated investors have gotten over the last 10 years in the types of questions they ask about ESG when they're going to a real estate company or any company that they're investing in. It used to be, do you have a sustainability program? Great, tell us about it. Now it's like, have you looked at LEDs? Do you report to science-based targets? How many RECs and offsets are you buying? Like, they're getting much more specific. Particularly a good sort of subset of investors in Europe are driving a lot of this action right now, but there's other investors that are sort of following suit. So I think in the private investment space, you're starting to see a bit of a sea change there, and I think that's driving a lot of the action.
Hey, Joe,
yeah.
Let me just add one thing really, really quickly. So, if your building is valued, and even if you're not leasing your building and you need to value it, you may sell it at some day, and at which point it's going to be valued by the market. Over the next decade or so, there are going to be haves and have-nots. There are going to be those people that have done the work, reduced emissions, increased efficiency, reduced emissions in their space, included on-site renewables, and et cetera, and those that haven't. And just simply the cap rate, even if your occupancy doesn't reflect that, the cap rate that an appraiser looks at your building with will look at that added risk, and you're going to lose value. So there's a lot of financial reasons to be going down this path today.
Yeah, and I would add that more and more people are becoming more and more aware of the need for sustainability initiatives. I don't know if how many of you have seen the David Attenborough documentary where he kind of reflects on the loss of the natural habitat in the world over the course of his lifetime of going out and doing his amazing documentaries. And it was somewhere up to like 50 to 70%. I can't remember the exact number, but it was a staggering number. I think it was 70% of the natural world has been overrun or farmed or so the non-human. I mean, it's staggering what we're facing here. And so more and more people, like I said, are starting to see this, and it's important for us to react to that. It's important to our customers. To Jim's point, it's becoming important to our customers as well. And we need to respond as good stewards of our customer relationships. We need to start looking and pushing hard on these sustainability efforts because they're expecting us to do that. We're the leaders doing that. We're the new superheroes. We're the new Avengers trying to save the world. And it's an important mission that we're all on. And I'm so glad to see so many participants in this Building Better Challenge and these summits meetings, because that's where we really need to be.
Thank you all. A little bit more of a technical question here. One person was asking that they're going to use a base, they're looking to set, or maybe have already set a base year reduction goal. So I presume that's an absolute reduction goal against the base year. But they want to be more specific by scope. So reducing scope 1, 2, and 3, kind of separate targets for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for different emission sources. Curious to hear from you all how you think about that. Are you setting kind of an absolute emissions reduction goal across all scopes and sources, or are you thinking about specific targets for individual contributors?
Well, for the city of Milwaukee, right now we're just looking at the overall, and part of that is because just the way where our emissions were coming from. So I think it's really dependent on where you are and where your emissions are generated from. But for example, we have one of our power plants is within the city limits. One is without. A majority of it's coming from that one power plant. A lot of our wastewater is actually within the city, emissions coming from that. So it changes the calculation a little bit. So I don't think it's as necessary for us to focus on scope 1 or scope 2 because we're by naturally the way it's set up, we're going to have more of an impact on scope 1. But I think it is dependent on what your situation is, where your emissions are really coming from.
We're also looking at overall, that might change over the next few years. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, well, we're looking at both, but the city of San Francisco is mandating, as well as several other communities, the electrification. Now, it's great that we're focusing on this, but I want to kind of pivot here to another issue, and I've seen questions come this on Slido. But as we'll have the Department of Environment specify electrification for the city of San Francisco and for outlying areas. But then you have the Department of Inspections, who isn't quite up to snuff on the technology that Department of Environment is pushing us to use. So the domestic water heat pumps, for instance, we're going through a nightmare, bureaucratic nightmare right now with just the permitting aspects. In one of our buildings that we did that, in another building it went just fine. And so it kind of highlights that there's some jurisdictional education that needs to happen from the top down, from the federal down to these local communities. Matthew, I think you talked about some of the challenges you're having with local authorities, the state governments, and those kind of things. So we really need to keep pushing on the local governments and all the way up to the federal governments to get an education program down to their local jurisdictions having authority, because right now a lot of the roadblocks are coming from those authorities, even when the same group, another group within that same authority figure, the state government or the city government, is mandating a certain pathway for us to take. And I'm all for electrification, but we also have then power companies that haven't upgraded their infrastructure yet. So there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. And that's why I keep focusing on the holistic approach of that. When you're looking at electrifying a building, you may not have the resource from the power company to support that initiative. And that's some of the problems we're finding in some of our older buildings when we're looking to electrify them. If I have a building built in 1910, trust me, the infrastructure of that building is not set up for electrification. And so when we look to rehab that building and finance a rehabilitation for that building, ripping out all the electricity can be very costly. And so there's a lot of different challenges we face on that approach. But in terms of looking holistically, I would say we look at both 1 and 2 phases, scopes of work on this. Every aspect of sustainability needs to be under consideration on some level.
Great. And I wish we could keep this going for like an hour. I have one final question to close this out here. And that question is, when you think about what needs to change, both at your organizations and in the world, and in terms of technology and policy and everything else, to achieve your carbon reduction targets, if you could sort of wave a magic wand and change one thing, invent one new technology, change one policy, change one person's mind that you think would be most impactful in helping you achieve your carbon targets, what would you wave your wand at?
I'm happy to go first because I got mine right on the tip of my tongue.
Go for it.
I've been waiting this whole time. So the one thing I would do is I would stop subsidizing the problem and start subsidizing the solutions with greater emphasis. So instead of giving $25 billion a year to the fossil fuel industry, I would put that money into electrification, into redoing older buildings, really put that money into renewable resources and sustainability. We need to stop subsidizing the problem and start subsidizing the solution. So my magic wand would do that for us. We would have a complete priority shift into really putting this as a number one priority. And also using that money for job training and to take those jobs that are in those sectors, because that's the big fear of change, is the jobs and the money lost. But we need to start looking at pushing that over to renewable resources. We can do this. We have the technology. We just lack the will, and we need to start pushing that forward. This group has the will. We need to make sure that everybody else has the will. So that would be mine.
I'll say one thing really quickly. No, we're running out of time. You know, a lot of state and city laws, regulations already in the books, a lot more coming. I would suggest that a federal government can't tell states and cities what to do, but I would suggest, and there is an effort here underway right now that you know we're part of. If the federal government were to put out guidelines and standards that cities and states around the country can adopt and create more of a level playing field, you know, particularly for folks like us that have, you know, assets across the country, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's a great one. Because from trying to create our own standards right now, there's obviously difficulty. So it'd be great to just be able to take on something that already exists. But I think one of the areas, and I mentioned it in my presentation, but that I would really love to have either a giant pot of money to go do it or some program would be the retrofit program we talked about. I think our housing sector, you know, when you look at the energy burn data, and we have areas of the city where people are spending 10 to 15% of their monthly income on their utility costs. You know, being able to reduce that to the national average of 3%, you know, the cost, obviously the quality of living there is going to change dramatically. You're going to have that much more money to spend every month for necessary items, and obviously the job creation that comes along with it. So That's something that if we could find a way to really have a sustainable long-term retrofit program that could cover a lot more of the cost than we can currently for those homeowners, I think they're just having an amazing impact.
Great, all great answers. Thank you guys. And I think this is really cool to have three very diverse perspectives on the same issue on this panel. So thanks for a great conversation. I think this was awesome. And if the comments we're getting are any indication, people really liked it. So you can reach out to these guys. We're going to have their contact information at the end if you want to follow up on some of your questions. Just to quickly close this out here, if you want to bring back up the slide deck, Kyle, a few additional resources. So I mentioned the low carbon pilot that over 55 of our partners are now participating in to demonstrate low carbon pathways at the building level or the plant level. There's a link here, but you can also just Google it. This will be available when the slides are shared. Also links here to the financing navigator, the finance and resilience toolkit, and the slope tool that myself and Matt talked about. If you go to the next slide, I do want to also highlight the Better Buildings summer webinar series, which is upcoming. So this is going to feature conversations from many partners about some of the most pressing energy and sustainability and climate challenges that they're facing. So if you want to register for any of these webinars, go to Better Buildings Solutions Center and click on events and webinars. And if we move to the final slide here, I just want to thank everyone again for a great session. Here's the contact information as promised. We're also going to launch a short feedback survey in Slido, so it'd be very helpful to get your feedback on how this panel went. We'd like to do more like this in future. So if you want that, of course, it'd be great to get your feedback on whether this was useful. And we also rely on that for designing all future events. So appreciate a little bit of feedback from you all. And if you want to learn anything more about these topics or access any of the resources we mentioned, the Better Buildings Solutions Center is always available. So Jim, Matt, Mark, thank you guys so much, and look forward to the next one.
Thank you all. Thank you, Joe.
Rest of the summer, guys.
Thank you.